making sense of the latest data from Giving USA. Hi, Bill Stanczykiewicz. This is the first day from the fundraising school, and I'm joined again today by Josh Birkholz, the CEO of BWF, a leading fundraising and nonprofit leadership consulting firm in the United States, and also board chair of the Giving USA Foundation when this year's report came out. And Josh, welcome back to the Fundraising Schools podcast.
Hey, Bill, it's really great to be here. Thank you.
Now, we want to encourage our audience, if you want to get into the granular detail of the report released in 2024, go to our archives and find our interview with Dr. Anna Pruitt, who broke down all of those numbers. What we're asking Josh to do today is kind of take a step back and help us make sense of these data. The top line number, $557 billion, the highest total ever, a record when we think about the money in terms of current dollars, the value of the dollar, the year the dollar was donated. When we look at current dollars, the numbers are up in all of the source categories where the money was coming from. When we adjust for inflation, all of them are down except one, and that's the area of bequests. When we look at those current dollars, all 9 subsectors receiving the dollars are up. When we adjust for inflation, 2 of them, religion and international affairs, are down. And this is where a lot of the controversy comes in, the disagreement comes in, some of the negative feelings come in. Josh, help us make sense of this. When you looked at these data, what analyses came to your mind?
Yeah. Well, first of all, when I think the big picture of the giving dollars, I always think that this isn't like the S&P 500 or the market, where this is the value of the philanthropic sector going up or down. This is a number that starts over at 0 every year. So that means there were $557 billion in new gifts that came in last year. So if you think about it that way, every year we're getting $500 billion more gifts on top of gifts on top of gifts. Now, if you think of, say, inflation over the last 4 or 5 years, it's been unprecedented. I think we had a peak a couple of years ago. We hit 9% at one point. And so we see these numbers all over the place. And honestly, it does build up more in our perception. If you think of an everyday person going to the store to get milk or eggs or get gas, or should I give $50 to charity, one of those might drop off. And unfortunately, we've seen that be charity for the everyday donor. However, the markets really went up last year, and the markets seem to track closer with the high net worth donors, which make up more and more of the giving picture every year. Now, the thing is, when we think about inflation, are we honestly thinking about that when we're making that gift? We think in round numbers often, $100, $1,000, maybe $1 million for some of the wealthy folks. They're not thinking, oh, it went up 9%. I better make that $1 million, and 9, add the extra 9%.
Right.
They're not thinking that way. And it makes sense. Nevertheless, as we look back at the data, it turns out that our really generous years in 2021 were just even more generous based on how tough that dollar was against the everyday pocketbook.
Yeah, and Josh, you were mentioning inflation. If you could just expand on that a little more, how much of a confounding factor has inflation been these last 3 or 4 years when we look at Giving USA? When inflation shot up to 10%, the highest in 4 or 5 decades. And fortunately, as we record this interview, it's gradually coming down, but that's not disinflation. It's coming down. It's not deflation, where it's going back to where it used to be. And therefore, we're comparing not apples to apples, but it seems like apples to a larger fruit like watermelon, because inflation has just been so historically out of whack. How difficult it has been for you and your colleagues to look at these data in the context of where inflation's been these last several years?
Yeah, it's a nuanced topic, and I think it can be very confusing for a lot of folks. In some ways, inflation informs how we record philanthropy probably more than the behavior. Now, with some exceptions, when inflation's high, it does put pressure, and it affects economic perceptions. Do I feel better off than I did before? And is that going to influence my giving? But if we look at the last 40 years of giving in the United States, giving has only gone down 4 times in those 40 years. And if you look at all the years that had recession, giving actually went up in more of the recession years than it went down. So first of all, giving is remarkably resilient, partly because giving is not just a factor of economics, but it's a cultural value. It's something we choose to do to make life better for others, to solve some big problems and so forth. So there is more to it than the economic factors. Now, that said, we do know the economy pulls on giving. When inflation goes up, and I feel like I have less to give, I do give less, and that does seem to affect certain populations more than others. Wealthier are able often to make money regardless of economic circumstances. And as giving becomes more and more reflective of the wealthier populations, we're proving to be resilient to that. And what I mean by that is if you look at, let's say, the S&P 500, it goes up, it goes down, goes spikes. As we're talking today, we're kind of in a market downturn because of some questions about job data and so forth. And when the markets go up and down, giving does go up and down, but not as extreme in either direction. It's actually quite resilient to that. So when we look at inflation as another economic indicator that our money isn't worth as much as it was before, it might influence some perception on giving, but it's probably more so that it's influencing what that dollar meant as we compare dollars year after year. I think the apple to the watermelon is fair because it's how much money we had to spend. Those current dollars going up, it's real increase. It's 2% increase in current dollars. It was more billions of dollars that were given. It's just, are those billions worth as much as they used to be? Now, that said, giving has remained about 2% of our GDP throughout our history. In 2021, we hit in 2022, we hit 2.3%, which is about the high point. But regardless of the economy, about 2% is reflected in how much is given to charity each year.
And at the fundraising school, we advise the following hack as it relates to inflation. And that is when you set your organization's budget for the upcoming fiscal year, maybe you budget on a 2-year window, estimate inflation, build inflation into your budget, talk to your bank, talk to financial people on your board, others who are friends of your nonprofit, and get an estimate of what the inflation rate might be in the next year or two. Maybe guess a little bit higher than that, set your budget accordingly. Your fundraising goals flow from there. If you hit your goals, now the current dollars make total sense to you because you had your goal, you raised the dollars this year. So make sure you're factoring inflation into your budgets as you set your fundraising goals. And as Josh said, economics are just one factor of charitable giving. You need to be making your fundraising case statement, your fundraising case for support every single day, telling your stories every single day. And Josh, again, to really meet our donors at their philanthropic values and their philanthropic motivations.
I think that's spot on. And I appreciate you saying that because as we're facing economic uncertainty, there's certain things we can do. So the reality is that giving has become more and more top heavy, some might say, and there's stress in the everyday donor. First of all, culturally, I think we need to do all we can to be welcoming of the everyday donor because I think that's the pipeline for future philanthropy. And I mean, double down. Our company's doubling down. The sector is with the Generosity Commission due in September. We're all thinking about how do we inspire generosity among the Americans and really to further than that, globally, how do we inspire generosity? But right now, as we're factoring in inflation, also recognizing that some of the wealthier donors give in more complex ways. We saw that foundation giving increased last year while individual giving decreased. Now, did that really happen? Absolutely, in terms of how we measure, but the number of philanthropic decisions made by individuals is largely unchanged. What's changed is how those individuals are choosing to give through structured foundations, through donor advised funds, through mechanisms we haven't even thought of, though, create some new organizational structure by which that they give. So think about also, as we're factoring in inflation, what's our ability to work with donors in an entrepreneurial way about how they might give through different structured ways. We used to talk about blending gifts as an outright gift and a bequest. Now think of blended gifts as an outright gift, plus maybe something from their company or an employee giving program, their DAF through their family foundation, working with their family office, pools within a community. Think about how we can be more creative working with those donors, seen as they're navigating the economy and doing different tools. Are we ready to respond in turn with understanding those tools?
Hey, just one example of Josh's excellent point. There are donor advised funds. And, you look, we had 1 million of those created through 2020. Another 1 million were created over the next 2 years through 2022. This has just become a very popular mechanism for charitable giving. And again, we're thinking about the individual who's created the DAF. And yet when the money comes out, it's called a grant and counted on the foundation side. Just again, one of those nuances to be aware of. as we look at these data. You know, Josh, one of the other things, I love the 40-year chart. I love how you talked about, giving's only gone down 4 years over the last many, many decades, those wider range snapshots. And for me, one of the more big picture takeaways is when we compare to 2019, before the pandemic, before the very necessary rise in awareness around racial and social justice and reconciliation issues, that both of those affecting charitable giving in such strong ways. But, if that last quote unquote normal year was 2019, we are well ahead of that, both in terms of current and inflation adjusted dollars. The trend recently in that 5-year window is very positive.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. The slope is a little bit steeper up. People say, are we back to normal? I'd say it's a new normal, and it's a different normal because there's certainly been changes since that time. We do know that Americans respond in times of crisis. When there's humanitarian, natural disasters, there's just challenges that are collectively experienced with our community, Americans step up and give. We see that in a hurricane response or in an earthquake, or if there's a challenge in the community that people give. Now, in a macro sense, in 2020, 2021, we had some pretty big crises all happen right together. It pulled some of our giving locally, and I think some of the humanitarian crises in terms of international conflicts pulled us back out externally so that we're giving in a broader way. But there's also been some changes. Like, I'll use one example, the arts. Let's talk about the arts. They've had unprecedented growth. 3 years ago, 29% growth. They went up 3% when giving went down the following year. And then this last year, they also exceeded 10% growth, year over year growth. And people are like, what's happening here? Because when times are tough, most of us philanthropic experts, quote unquote, would say that people give to immediate needs. So when times are tough, food, insecurity, shelter, so that people are taken care of. And when times are good, we give towards self-actualization, the future, the human condition, things such as like the arts, which makes life better as opposed to just surviving it. However, when the arts was disrupted during the pandemic and we could not meet together, and then suddenly we could, I think people realize that meeting together at humans is an essential need, just like food and shelter, and to think about what does it mean to be human. So not only did the economics favor, the arts often are supported more by wealthy individuals, I think the everyday person said, we need to be together as humans. And we saw giving as a reflection of that very human quality of caring for each other. So I think the arts reclassified. And that's an example of a new normal. It's not only the given recovered, but we also thought about our philanthropic commitments and what that means culturally and to our relationship with each other. So I think it's an exciting time for philanthropy, despite all the economic fears and fears of inflation.
What a great point and a great example from a subsector that really exemplifies what's been going on these last 5 years or so. Josh, earlier on, you talked about the everyday donor, and it's my understanding in this year's Giving USA data, certainly there are ultra high net worth donors making very large gifts. But it's my understanding that that was less the case this time around. Not to say that there aren't any, but that there weren't as many. Is that an accurate analysis? And what might that mean about what happened with charitable giving in 2023?
Yeah, I would say it's a very small group of people to have a really large trend line. So we did have some really big, substantial gifts. Ends of one. We've seen it from Mackenzie Scott, certainly. Michael Bloomberg. I think Elon Musk had a very sizable wealth transfer with a charitable mechanism as well. And it is fewer this year. I think it is notable that the top 5 mega gifts this last year, 4 of them gave them right into foundations. So they went into structured models, which will later grant that money out. So I think it's reflective of how giving is changing a little bit. We still have similar, well, I should say the perennial favorites. We see Michael Bloomberg and Mackenzie Scott on those lists over and over again, which I think is a wonderful group. It's tough for me to say that there's a trend on that because overall, I think the giving is still skewing to the higher net worth group within that top 1% is a large portion, but the 0.01% was down a little bit, I'd say, this last year. I'm not concerned about it, to be honest. I think it was anomalous.
And Josh, what else, though, when you looked at these data, what were some of the things that jumped off the page to you? As you look at the follow-up coverage of Giving USA, what do you think is maybe being misunderstood, maybe not being reported correctly, or conversely, in a positive way, points you'd like to see receive more emphasis?
Yeah, no, I think that's a wonderful question because the data which is the longest data around giving. We go back to the 1950s, we've been tracking this. And because of that longitudinal nature of this study, we've had to look at data in a similar way year after year. And so what we've done is we've measured the giving to registered charities. So these are 501c3 organizations. Now, the reality is that all that it means to be generous is giving to a registered charity? Honestly, generosity is a much broader example. And we've seen that when we give a large tip at a restaurant, when we go to a GoFundMe campaign for one of our friends and neighbors, even just volunteering in certain ways that might not be showing up in terms of financial records. There's generosity happening everywhere. Now, to Giving USA's credit, we've captured this qualitatively. If you read our wonderful text, all of our chapters capture stories of generosity beyond giving to registered charities. But I think that's part of the story of this everyday donor. As we've seen even from other outlets like the Fundraising Effectiveness Project at AFP, through Giving Tuesdays, that the number of people giving declines while the giving amount goes up. But is generosity actually declining? That's harder to say because I think people are giving in different ways. Similarly, corporate giving, while we did see an increase in current dollars this last year, corporate giving has been on a multi-decade trend of giving less as a percent of its overall profits. Now, are they becoming less generous? Perhaps, but we've also seen environmental and social initiatives, DEI programs, volunteer time offs, and other social good programs by companies that one would argue are charitable, but aren't showing up in our charitable statistics. So I do argue that there's nuance in generosity. We're a generous people. I'm really proud of the generosity of this country and proud to report on that through giving to registered charities, but also recognize giving is so much broader. Generosity is broader, and caring for each other is clearly a value we see every day in our neighborhoods.
Every researcher will tell us each data set, each research study has limitations. There's no such thing as a perfect data set. There's no such thing as a perfect research study. And Giving USA is very clear about where their limitations are. And for example, Josh mentioned the giving from the corporate sector. Well, that does not include the dollars coming out of the marketing department because philosophically that's thought of maybe that's not exactly philanthropy, right? Maybe it's really more marketing. And yet the fundraiser says, does it say U.S. Treasury on the dollar? I'm going to count that towards my fundraising goal, right? So there are all sorts of things like that to help us understand this report. And Josh, while I have this opportunity in this interview, I've shared this with you in person when we've been at conferences together. Last year, you modeled civility for all of us, including in our sector. When one of those limitations was called out, somebody said, yeah, what about all of those $10 gifts that are happening online? What about all of those $10 bills that are being dropped in at the religious congregation? There's no way you're able to count those. And your response talked about the limitation of the study very constructively. And some in our audience might be saying that, like, what about those smaller gifts digitally or in cash? How do you and your colleagues at the Giving USA Foundation approach that very important topic?
It's a very solid question. And you're right, there's absolutely limitations. So I'm very proud of the scope that we do take, first of all. We work really hard, and it's very comprehensive. We get the data from the IRS in a registered way that's meaningful and longitudinal. So the data now compared to 10 years ago, it is apples to apples in terms of the source and the how we measure those things. But the reality is there's so much more. So I've really been trying to encourage others to get involved and to help us. Give us ideas for how can we capture some of this data to capture the true nature of benevolence. So what we are doing is through our editorial review board, we're really working with practitioners to get those stories so that we get a clear understanding of the picture. We're collaborating with other outlets. Like I mentioned, Fundraising Effectiveness Project, Giving Tuesday, the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy has been really wonderful with some of their panel study data that has influenced us to understand some of those bigger pictures. So we're looking at new ways to understand that. While I don't expect that we'll change the core methodology around the giving to registered charities so that we can always measure that in a fair way that we have and with an academically rigorous way, I'm hoping that we can continue to expand beyond the qualitative, beyond the great stories of generosity to quantitative means of showing that generosity in a broader sense. So it's something that we're actively working on. Our research team at the Giving USA Foundation, our research committee, is working on funding projects specifically on that area right now. It's a high level of attention from all of us because we care really deeply about generosity, and we're very proud of Giving USA, and we wanted to reflect the generous nature of this country, the way it keeps evolving and keeps doing wonderful things for our society.
We are absolutely grateful for that $10 gift that happens digitally, that happens in cash at our event, at the religious congregation, whatever the case might be. And the folks who lead us with Giving USA at the Giving USA Foundation, folks like Josh Birkholz, my colleagues at the school, Dr. Anna Pruitt, Dr. Una Osley, they know, and they're on it. And if you have suggestions, let us know. Email me if you want to, billstan@iu.edu. I'll connect you to my colleagues. And if you have an idea how to capture this, because again, Josh, you mentioned the importance of generosity. Sometimes that $10 gift is the most generous gift. It's the most sacrificial based on that person's wealth and income.
No question. If from a religious perspective, it's often called the widow's mite, the story of giving all that you have. And I think there's some reality to that. I mean, giving is ultimately a selfless act that returns so much back to the giver. It's such a wonderful thing. Like the motivation might be selfless. And some would say, oh, is it really all selfless? Is it all altruistic? And I often think about, as compared to what? For a wealthy person, buying a yacht, flying around the globe versus giving to charity, even if they get some credit for it, I think that's an okay thing. And I really believe that, because I think wealthy people, as well as everyday people, we desire happiness. We desire to do things of purpose and to make a difference in other people's lives and significance. And maybe the level that we do that is different, but we can all make one person's life better. If you think of that $10 gift, someone might be able to spend millions on solving food insecurity issues, but you could give someone a sandwich, and I can tell you that they'll be happy to eat that day.
That is a great point, and reemphasizes our definition of fundraising as the gentle art of teaching the joy of giving. And folks, as you fundraise, remember, you are in the joy delivery business. And that's what we emphasize in our 24 public courses at the Fundraising School that can lead to 4 different certificates. We also can take parts of courses, knit them together in a tailor-made way through our custom training programs. And all of our coursework can be in person or online in the United States or anywhere across the world. We have our quarterly webinars and these weekly podcasts. And of course, all this gathered in our textbook, Achieving Excellence in Fundraising, now out in the book's 5th edition. Information about the Fundraising School is online at go.iu.edu/TFRS for the Fundraising School. Josh, always a delight. Thanks for being back with us on the Fundraising School's First Day podcast.
Thank you so much, Bill.
And our podcast produced today by my colleagues Mike Anthony and Jennifer Boffman. I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz. And now you are more fully informed on this first day from the Fundraising School.